In the harsh frontier of 1870's Wyoming Territory, a woman with nothing but a cast-iron skillet and wounded pride stumbles into a cattle camp at sunset. Delilah Quinn has been cast out from the mining town of Copper Creek after refusing the unwanted advances of a powerful foreman. Now she wanders the high desert plains, her stomach empty and her future uncertain. At the flickering campfire, a quiet cowboy named Sam offers her simple work. Cook for him, and he'll pay her fair. He seems like any other ranch, hand-weathered boots, worn hat, sleeping under the stars. What Delilah doesn't know is that this humble cowboy is actually Samuel Prescott III, heir to the vast Prescott Spread, a ranch empire that stretches across 3 counties and controls half the territory. But when a local sheriff tries to run her out of town and Sam's true identity is revealed in defending her, will Delilah see his love as genuine, or will she believe she was nothing more than a wealthy man's charity case? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain as Delilah Quinn clutched her mother's cast-iron skillet against her chest, the metal still warm from the dying embers of her last campfire. 3 days had passed since she'd fled Copper Creek, 3 days of walking through the endless expanse of Wyoming Territory with nothing but the clothes on her back and the stubborn pride that kept her moving forward. Her boots, once sturdy leather meant for kitchen work, now bore holes that let in the gritty desert sand. The calico dress her mother had sewn for her 23rd birthday hung loose on her frame, faded from sun and worn thin at the elbows. But the skillet that remained perfect, seasoned black and smooth as river stone, a testament to generations of Quinn women who'd made something from nothing. The mining town of Copper Creek had promised opportunity when she'd arrived 6 months ago, answering an advertisement for a cook at the Silver Dollar boarding house. The pay was decent, the work honest, and for a time, Delilah had thought she might finally build the stable life her mother had always wanted for her. Then Marcus Henley, the mine foreman, had started lingering after meals, his eyes following her movements as she cleared tables and swept floors. "A woman like you shouldn't be alone," he'd said one evening, cornering her in the kitchen. "I could take care of you proper, give you a real home." When she'd refused his advances politely, he'd grown insistent. When she'd continued to decline, he'd grown mean. The final confrontation had come when he'd tried to force himself on her in the pantry, and she'd struck him with a rolling pin hard enough to leave a knot on his temple. By morning, she'd been branded a troublemaker. The boarding house owner, afraid of losing Henley's business, had given her an hour to pack. No references, no final pay, just the warning that if she stayed in Copper Creek, things would go badly for her. Now, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of amber and rose, Delilah crested a low ridge and saw smoke rising from a valley below. Her heart quickened with hope. Where there was smoke, there might be people, and where there were people, there might be work. The cattle camp sprawled along a creek bed, a collection of canvas tents and makeshift corrals that housed perhaps a dozen men and several hundred head of cattle. The animals grazed peacefully in the gathering dusk, their lowing a gentle counterpoint to the crackle of the central fire. A man sat alone beside the flames, his back to her as she approached. He wore a simple brown shirt and worn denim pants, his hat tilted low over his face. Something about his posture relaxed but alert reminded her of her father, who'd been a ranch hand before the consumption took him. "Evening," she called out, stopping at what she judged a respectful distance. The man turned, and she saw a face weathered by sun and wind, with kind eyes the color of creek water after rain. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a mustache that had seen better grooming. When he smiled, the expression transformed his entire face, chasing away the solitude that had settled there. "Evening, miss," he said, rising to his feet with easy grace. "You look like you've been traveling hard." "I have." She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm looking for work. I can cook, and I can cook well." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her worn dress and the skillet she carried like a shield. "What's your name?" "Delilah Quinn." "I'm Sam." He gestured toward the fire. "Sam Fletcher, and as it happens, I could use a cook. The boys and I have been making do with beans and hardtack for the better part of a week." "I can do better than beans and hardtack," she said, allowing herself a small smile. "But I'll need supplies." "We've got supplies. Beef, flour, coffee, whatever you need." He paused, his expression growing serious. "What happened to you, Miss Quinn? If you don't mind me asking." The question hung between them, and Delilah felt the familiar burn of shame and anger. But there was something in Sam's eyes, a genuine concern, without judgment, that made her want to answer honestly. "I worked in a boarding house in Copper Creek. The mine foreman took a shine to me, wouldn't take no for an answer. When I defended myself, they made me out to be the problem." She straightened her shoulders. "I won't apologize for protecting myself." "Wouldn't expect you to," Sam said quietly. "Man should keep his hands to himself, especially when a lady's made her wishes clear." The simple acceptance in his voice nearly undid her. She'd expected questions, demands for details, perhaps even doubt about her version of events. Instead, Sam nodded once and turned back to the fire. "You hungry? I've got some coffee on, and there's bread from town." "I am," she admitted, settling on a fallen log that served as a bench. "It's been a while since I've had a proper meal." Sam poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her, the warmth spreading through her palms like a blessing. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it chased away the desert chill that had settled in her bones. As they sat in comfortable silence, other men began to drift toward the fire. They were a mixed, groupsome young, some grizzled, all bearing the marks of hard outdoor work. Their clothes were patched and practical, their faces honest and open. "Boys," Sam said as they gathered around, "this is Miss Delilah Quinn. She's going to be cooking for us." A chorus of pleased murmurs greeted this announcement. A young man with freckles and red hair grinned wide. "Ma'am, I'm Jake Morrison. Been eating Charlie's cooking for 2 weeks now, and I was starting to think I might waste away." "Hey now," protested an older man with silver whiskers. "My cooking ain't that bad." "Charlie, your coffee could strip paint," said another hand, earning laughs from the group. Delilah found herself smiling despite her exhaustion. There was an easy camaraderie among these men, a sense of family that she'd rarely encountered. They treated her with polite respect, but without the awkward formality she'd expected. "What do you need to get started, Miss Quinn?" Sam asked. "Just Delilah, please." She looked around the camp, assessing the possibilities. "I can work with what's here. Tomorrow, I'll need to know what supplies you have, what the men like to eat, how many I'm cooking for." 12 of us, counting me," Sam said. "We've got a supply wagon that comes through once a week. Anything special you need, we can get it." "I don't need anything special," Delilah said. "Just good ingredients and a decent fire." As the evening wore on, she found herself drawn into the gentle rhythm of camp life. The men shared stories of their day's work, discussed the weather and the cattle, and gradually included her in their conversation. She learned that they were driving a herd north toward the railroad, a journey that would take several more weeks. Sam, she noticed, spoke less than the others, but when he did, the men listened with a respect that went beyond mere courtesy. There was something about him, a quiet authority, a sense of being completely at ease in his own skin that set him apart. When the fire began to die down and the men started drifting toward their bedrolls, Sam showed her to a small tent that had been hastily erected near the supply wagon. "It's not much," he said, "but it's private and dry. There's blankets inside and you'll be safe here." "Thank you," she said, and meant it. "Sam, why are you being so kind to me? You don't know anything about me." He was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the stars that blazed overhead in the clear desert sky. "Maybe because I know what it's like to be judged for things that aren't your fault," he said finally. "Maybe because you've got the look of someone who's been fighting her whole life just to keep her head above water." The words hit her with unexpected force, and she felt tears prick at her eyes. "I have been fighting," she whispered. "I know," he said gently, "but you don't have to fight alone anymore, not here." As she settled into the tent, wrapping herself in the rough wool blankets, Delilah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. The ground was hard beneath her, and the wind rattled the canvas walls. But she was safe, she was wanted, and tomorrow she would do what she did, best create something nourishing from simple ingredients. Outside, she could hear Sam moving around the camp, checking on the cattle and banking the fire. There was something reassuring about the sounds, the presence of someone watching over things while she slept. For the first time since leaving Copper Creek, she closed her eyes, without fear of what dawn might bring. In his own tent across the camp, Sam Fletcher, whose true name was Samuel Prescott III, on his bedroll, and pulled out a worn leather journal. By the light of a small oil lamp, he began to write, his pen moving across the pages with careful precision. The journal was filled with sketches of landscapes and cattle, pressed flowers and leaves, fragments of poetry and philosophical thoughts. But tonight, he found himself writing about grey eyes that held too much sadness and hands that gripped a cast-iron skillet like a lifeline. He'd been riding under a false name for 3 months now, fleeing the suffocating expectations of his family and the arranged marriage that awaited him in Denver. The Prescott name carried weight in Wyoming Territory. His grandfather had been one of the first to establish a major cattle operation, and the family ranch now stretched across 3 counties. But wealth and influence came with a price. Every friendship was suspect, every romantic interest potentially motivated by his fortune. He'd grown tired of being seen as a prize to be won, rather than a man to be known. Out here, as Sam Fletcher, he was valued for his skill with cattle and his steady leadership. The men respected him for who he was, not what he owned. It was the first time in his adult life that he'd felt genuinely free. Now, watching Delilah Quinn eat her simple meal with such gratitude, seeing the way she held herself with dignity despite her circumstances, he felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with pity or charity. She was beautiful, certainly, but it was more than that. She had substance, character, the kind of strength that came from facing hardship and refusing to break. He closed the journal and extinguished the lamp, but sleep was slow to come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove himself worthy of the trust she'd placed in him. He only hoped that when the time came and he knew it would come to reveal his true identity, she would understand why he'd chosen to live this lie. The desert wind whispered through the camp, carrying the scent of sage and promise, while 2 people who'd found unexpected sanctuary in each other's presence settled into dreams of what tomorrow might bring. The morning sun had barely crested the eastern ridge when Delilah began her work, the familiar weight of her mother's skillet, a comfort in her hands. She'd risen before dawn, as was her custom, and built up the fire to prepare breakfast for the men who'd shown her such unexpected kindness. The camp came alive gradually, the sound of cattle lowing and men stirring from their bedrolls, creating a peaceful symphony that reminded her of better times. She'd found flour, bacon, and fresh eggs in the supply wagon, along with wild onions growing near the creek. Soon the aroma of frying bacon and fresh biscuits filled the morning air. "Lord have mercy," Charlie said as he approached the fire, his weathered face breaking into a grin. "That smells like heaven itself." "Just breakfast," Delilah said, but she couldn't hide her pleasure at the compliment. "Nothing fancy." Sam emerged from his tent, his dark hair still tousled from sleep, and the sight of him made something flutter in her chest. He moved with quiet confidence, greeting each of his men by name and checking on the cattle with practiced ease. When he approached the fire, his smile was warm and genuine. "Morning, Delilah. How did you sleep?" "Well enough," she replied, serving him a plate of eggs and bacon alongside 2 golden biscuits, "better than I have in weeks." He accepted the food with thanks, and she watched as he took the first bite. His eyes closed briefly, and when he opened them, she saw something that made her heart skip, not just appreciation, but genuine pleasure, as if her simple cooking had touched something deep within him. "This is remarkable," he said quietly. "I haven't had biscuits like this since," he paused, catching himself, "since I was a boy." The other men gathered around the fire, their praise enthusiastic and heartfelt. Jake Morrison declared it the best breakfast he'd ever eaten, while old Charlie shook his head in wonder at the lightness of her biscuits. Even the quietest of the hands, a man named Tom, who rarely spoke, nodded his approval. As the men prepared for their day's work, Delilah began cleaning up, her movements efficient and practiced. She was gathering the tin plates when she heard the sound of approaching horses, several riders coming fast from the direction of the main road. Sam's head snapped up, his expression immediately alert. "Stay near the fire, Delilah," he said quietly, his voice carrying an authority she hadn't heard before. 5 riders crested the ridge, their dust-covered horses breathing hard. At their head rode a man wearing a sheriff's badge, his face set in grim lines. Behind him came 4 deputies, their hands resting casually on their gun belts. "Morning," the sheriff called out as he reined in his horse. "I'm Sheriff Watkins from Copper Creek, looking for a woman named Delilah Quinn." Delilah's blood turned to ice. She'd hoped her trail would be cold by now, that Marcus Henley would have moved on to other pursuits. But here was proof that her reputation had followed her into the desert. "What business do you have with Miss Quinn?" Sam asked, stepping forward to position himself between Delilah and the mounted men. "She's wanted for questioning, in connection with an assault on a prominent citizen," Watkins replied, his eyes fixed on Delilah. "Marcus Henley suffered a serious injury, and there are witnesses who saw this woman flee the scene." "That's a lie," Delilah said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I defended myself against his unwanted advances. If he was injured, it was because he wouldn't take no for an answer." "That's not how Mr. Henley tells it," the sheriff said. "He says you came at him unprovoked, then stole money from the boarding house before you ran." "I never stole anything," Delilah protested. "I left with only what was mine." "Well, that's something for a judge to sort out," Watkins said, dismounting. "Miss Quinn, you'll need to come with us." "She's not going anywhere." The quiet authority in Sam's voice made everyone turn to look at him. He stood with his feet planted wide, his hands loose at his sides, but there was something in his posture that spoke of controlled danger. "I beg your pardon," the sheriff said, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "I said she's not going anywhere," Sam repeated. "Miss Quinn is under my protection now. If you want to question her, you can do it here, in front of witnesses." Sheriff Watkins studied Sam with new interest, taking in his worn clothes and humble surroundings. "And who might you be, Cowboy?" "Sam Fletcher. These are my men, and this is my camp. Miss Quinn is employed here as our cook, and she's done nothing wrong." "You don't understand," Watkins said. "This is official business. I have a warrant." "Let me see it." The sheriff's eyebrows rose at the demand, but he reached into his jacket and produced a folded paper. Sam took it, his eyes scanning the document with a thoroughness that surprised Delilah. For a simple ranch hand, he seemed remarkably comfortable reading legal documents. "This warrant is for questioning, not arrest," Sam said finally, "and it's issued by Judge Morrison in Copper Creek, who has no jurisdiction in this county." "How do you know about jurisdiction?" one of the deputies asked suspiciously. Sam's smile was thin and dangerous. "I know a lot of things, including the fact that you're a long way from home, Sheriff, and you're on open range that doesn't belong to Copper Creek." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Delilah could see the other ranch hands positioning themselves subtly around the camp, their loyalty to Sam evident in their readiness to back his play. "Look here, Fletcher," Watkins said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this woman is coming with me. If you interfere with official business, I'll have you arrested too." "On what charge?" Sam asked pleasantly. "Protecting an innocent woman from false accusations." "Innocent?" The sheriff laughed harshly. "You don't know what you're dealing with here, boy. This woman is trouble. She's got a history of causing problems for decent men." "The only problem I see," Sam said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet, "is a corrupt lawman trying to intimidate a woman who defended herself against assault. Now you listen here." "No, you listen," Sam stepped forward, and suddenly the humble ranch hand was gone, replaced by someone with unmistakable authority. "You're going to mount up and ride back to Copper Creek. You're going to tell Marcus Henley that Miss Quinn is under my protection, and if he wants to pursue this matter further, he can take it up with the territorial court." "And who's going to make me?" Watkins demanded. Sam's smile was cold as winter steel. "I am." The sheriff's hand moved toward his gun, but he froze when he saw that every man in the camp had suddenly found reason to be holding a rifle or had their hands resting on their sidearms. The message was clear. Sam commanded absolute loyalty from his men. "You're making a mistake, Fletcher," Watkins said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The only mistake would be forcing this issue." Sam replied, "Miss Quinn stays here. If you have a problem with that, you can discuss it with Judge Patterson in Cheyenne. He's the one with jurisdiction over this territory." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, the weight of unspoken challenges hanging between them. Then Sheriff Watkins spat in the dust and turned back to his horse. "This isn't over," he said as he mounted. "You can't hide behind your crew forever, Fletcher. And you, woman," he pointed at Delilah, "you'll get what's coming to you." "I think it's time you left," Sam said quietly. The sheriff wheeled his horse around and spurred it into a gallop, his deputies following. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving only dust and the echo of hoofbeats. Delilah stood frozen by the fire, her hands trembling with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. Sam turned to her, his expression gentle again, but she could see the steel still lurking in his eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked. "How did you know?" she whispered. "About the warrant? About jurisdiction?" Sam was quiet for a long moment, and she saw something flicker across his face, guilt, perhaps, or regret. "I've had some experience with legal matters," he said finally. "What kind of experience does a ranch hand have with legal matters?" Before he could answer, Jake Morrison approached, his young face troubled. "Sam, that sheriff, he recognized you. I could see it in his eyes. What if he comes back with more men?" "He won't," Sam said with certainty. "He's got no authority here, and he knows it." But Delilah saw the way the other men looked at Sam, the questions in their eyes. She wasn't the only one who'd noticed the change in him during the confrontation, the way he'd handled the legal document, the authority in his voice, the confidence with which he'd faced down armed men. "Sam," she said quietly, "who are you really?" He met her eyes, and she saw the war going on behind them, the desire to tell her the truth battling against the fear of losing what they'd begun to build together. "I'm exactly who I told you I was," he said finally. "Sam Fletcher, a man who believes in protecting those who can't protect themselves." But as he walked away to check on the cattle, Delilah couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just witnessed something that changed everything. The humble cowboy who'd offered her work and shelter was someone else entirely, someone with power and influence, someone who could face down a sheriff and his deputies without breaking a sweat. The question was, why was he hiding it? And what would happen when the truth finally came to light? The days following the sheriff's visit settled into a rhythm that felt both natural and carefully constructed. Delilah threw herself into her cooking with renewed purpose, as if creating perfect meals could somehow repay Sam for the protection he'd offered. But beneath the surface comfort of routine, questions simmered like a pot left too long on the fire. She watched Sam more carefully now, noting the small inconsistencies that she'd previously dismissed. The way he read the supply invoices with the ease of someone accustomed to complex documents. How the other men deferred to him not just out of respect, but with the automatic obedience usually reserved for those born to command. Most telling was the gold signet ring she'd glimpsed on his right hand during breakfast, quickly covered when he noticed her looking. "Miss Delilah," Jake Morrison said on the third morning after the confrontation, "I've been thinking about what that sheriff said, about you having a history of trouble." She paused in her kneading of bread dough, her hands stilling in the smooth mixture. "What about it?" "Well, it don't make sense. A woman who cooks like you do, who works as hard as you do, that's not the kind of person who goes looking for trouble." He scratched his freckled nose thoughtfully. "Makes a man wonder what kind of lies that sheriff was spreading." Maybe some people just don't like women who stand up for themselves, she said quietly. Maybe so. But Sam sure set him straight, didn't he? Jake's admiration was clear in his voice. Never seen anyone face down a sheriff like that. Takes a special kind of man to do something like that. What do you mean, special? Jake glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. Well, Sam's different from the rest of us. You can see it in little things. The way he talks sometimes, like he's had education. The way he knows about legal stuff. And did you see how he handled that warrant? Read it like he'd seen plenty of them before. Before Delilah could respond, Sam himself approached the fire, his morning inspection of the cattle complete. He moved with the easy grace she'd come to associate with him, but now she noticed other things, the quality of his boots, clearly expensive despite their worn appearance, and the way he carried himself with unconscious authority. "Morning, Delilah, Jake." He accepted the cup of coffee she offered, their fingers brushing briefly. "Smells like another feast in the making." "Just bread and stew," she said, but she felt the familiar warmth that came from his praise. "Nothing's ever just anything when you make it," Sam said, and the sincerity in his voice made her cheeks flush. Jake cleared his throat. "Sam, I was wondering that sheriff yesterday, when he saw you, he looked like he recognized you. You ever have dealings with him before?" Sam's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his coffee cup. "Can't say that I have. Some men just don't like being told they're wrong." "Still," he backed down mighty quick for someone who came all that way. Jake persisted, almost like he knew better than to mess with you. "Maybe he just realized he was outnumbered," Sam said lightly, but Delilah caught the warning note in his voice. Jake, however, seemed oblivious to the subtle tension. "Or maybe he knew who you really are." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken implications. Sam stared at the young cowhand for a long moment, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm exactly who I've always said I am, Jake. A man trying to make an honest, living, moving cattle." "Sure, Sam. Of course you are." But Jake's tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. As the morning progressed, Delilah found herself paying closer attention to the interactions between Sam and his men. There was genuine affection there, real friendship, but underneath it all was a current of deference that went beyond mere respect for a skilled ranch hand. When the supply wagon arrived later that day, she watched Sam examine the invoice with practiced efficiency, his eyes scanning the numbers with the speed of someone accustomed to financial documents. The wagon driver, a grizzled man named Pete, tipped his hat with unusual formality when he addressed Sam. "Everything in order, Sam?" Pete caught himself mid-sentence, shooting a nervous glance at Delilah. "Everything's fine, Pete. Same as always." But Delilah had caught the near slip, and from the look on Pete's face, this wasn't the first time he'd almost used a different name for Sam. That evening, as she cleaned up after supper, she noticed Sam sitting apart from the other men, writing in a leather journal by the light of an oil lamp. The book looked expensive, bound in fine leather and thick with pages. When he caught her looking, he closed it quickly and slipped it into his saddlebag. "You keep a journal?" she asked, settling beside him on the log that served as their evening gathering place. "Just notes about the cattle, the weather, nothing interesting." But he wouldn't meet her eyes as he said it. "My mother kept a journal," Delilah said. "She wrote down all her recipes, little observations about life, said it helped her remember the good times when the bad ones came along." "Sounds like a wise woman." "She was. She always told me that the truth has a way of coming out, no matter how hard people try to hide it." She studied his profile in the firelight. "She said that lies are like debts, they always come due eventually." Sam turned to look at her then, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Pain, longing, and underneath it all, a desperate desire to unburden himself. "Delilah," he said quietly, "what if the truth would hurt someone you cared about? What if telling it meant losing everything that mattered to you?" "Then maybe it's not the truth that would do the hurting," she said softly. "Maybe it's the lie." For a moment, she thought he might confess whatever secret he was carrying. His lips parted as if to speak, and she could see the words forming behind his eyes. But then Charlie called out from across the fire with a question about the next day's route, and the moment was lost. Later, lying in her tent and listening to the sounds of the camp settling down for the night, Delilah thought about the conversation. Sam was hiding something significant, that much was clear. But what? And why? She thought about the way he'd faced down Sheriff Watkins, the authority in his voice, the legal knowledge he'd displayed. She remembered the expensive journal, the deference of the supply wagon driver, the signet ring he'd tried to hide. A terrible suspicion began to form in her mind. What if Sam wasn't just another ranch hand? What if he was someone important, someone who could afford to play at being a simple cowboy? The thought made her stomach twist with a mixture of anger and hurt. She'd trusted him, allowed herself to care for him, even begun to imagine a future where they might build something together. But if he was lying about who he was, if he was keeping such a fundamental truth from her, then what else might be false? The questions tormented her as she lay awake, staring at the canvas ceiling of her tent. Outside, she could hear Sam moving around the camp on his final check of the night, his footsteps familiar and reassuring despite her doubts. Tomorrow, she decided, she would find out the truth. One way or another, she would discover who Sam Fletcher really was, whether the man she was falling in love with actually existed at all. Delilah's opportunity came the next afternoon, when Sam rode out with most of the men to search for strays that had wandered too far from the main herd. Only Charlie remained behind to watch the camp, and he'd settled down for his customary afternoon nap in the shade of the supply wagon. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached Sam's tent. She told herself she was only looking for answers to reasonable questions, but she knew what she was really doing, violating the trust of a man who'd shown her nothing but kindness and protection. The tent flap was tied shut, but not secured. She slipped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim interior. Sam's belongings were neatly arranged, his saddle and gear on one side, his bedroll spread across the ground, and a small wooden crate that served as a table. The leather journal lay on top of the crate, alongside a few other items that made her breath catch. The signet ring she'd glimpsed sat in a small dish, its gold surface catching what little light filtered through the canvas. Beside it lay a folded document with official-looking seals and ribbons. With trembling fingers, she picked up the ring and held it to the light. The design was elaborate, a coat of arms, featuring a rearing horse and an inscription she couldn't quite make out. But the craftsmanship was unmistakable. This was the ring of someone with wealth and standing. The document proved even more revealing. As she unfolded it carefully, her eyes widened at what she saw. Deed of property Prescott Spread, Ranch Samuel Prescott III, heir and beneficiary 200, 0 acres. The words swam before her eyes as the truth crashed over her like a cold mountain stream. Samuel Prescott III. She'd heard that name before everyone in the territory had. The Prescott family was cattle royalty, owners of one of the largest ranches in Wyoming, with holdings that stretched across 3 counties and influence that reached all the way to the territorial capital. And Sam, who ate her simple meals with such gratitude, who slept on the hard ground and worked beside his men, was the heir to all of it. "Dear God," she whispered, sinking onto his bedroll, as the implications hit her. The journal lay open beside her, and despite her better judgment, she found herself reading the words written in Sam's careful hand. 3 months now since I left Denver, and the suffocating expectations of family and society. Out here, I'm valued for what I can do, not what I own. For the first time in my life, I feel like I know who I really am. But how long can this deception last, and what will happen when the truth comes out? She turned the page, her eyes scanning entries about cattle drives and weather patterns, mixed with more personal observations. Father's letters continue to arrive, forwarded through Charlie. The marriage to Catherine Harrington grows more pressing in his mind. He cannot understand why I would choose this life when I could have comfort and position. But comfort bought with duty feels like a cage, and position without authenticity is meaningless. The tent flap rustled, and Delilah's heart stopped. She looked up to see Sam standing in the entrance, his face cycling through surprise, hurt, and something that might have been relief. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked quietly, stepping inside and letting the flap fall closed behind him. She set the journal down carefully, her hands shaking. "I needed to know." "So now you do." He moved to the crate and picked up the ring, turning it over in his palm. Samuel Prescott III, heir to the Prescott Spread, promised in marriage to Catherine Harrington of Denver, expected to take his place in society and continue the family legacy. "Why?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Why are you here, living like this, when you could have anything you wanted?" Sam sat down across from her, the small space suddenly feeling intimate, despite the tension between them. "Because everything I was supposed to want felt like poison," he said. "Do you know what it's like to have every friendship questioned, every romantic interest suspect? To never know if someone cares for you or for what you represent? So you decided to lie to everyone." "I decided to find out who I really am, when I'm not carrying the weight of other people's expectations." His eyes met hers, and she saw the pain there. "Including yours." The accusation stung because it held truth. She had been making assumptions about their future, had begun to imagine a life built on equality and shared struggle. Learning that he was one of the wealthiest men in the territory changed everything. "You let me think we were the same," she said, anger beginning to replace shock. "Two people with nothing making their way in the world. We are the same, in all the ways that matter." "Are we?" She gestured around the tent. "You're playing at being poor, Sam. When you get tired of this game, you can go back to your mansion and your servants and your arranged marriage. I don't have that luxury." "You think this is a game to me?" His voice hardened. "You think I'm out here for entertainment? I think you're a rich man's son having an adventure before you settle down to the life that was chosen for you." The words came out harsher than she'd intended, but she couldn't stop them. "And I think I was a fool to believe that what was happening between us was real." Sam reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "Delilah, please." "Miss Quinn," she corrected coolly. "I think we should maintain proper distance from now on." "Everything between us has been real," he said urgently. "My feelings for you, my respect for your strength and independence, none of that was a lie. But your name was, your circumstances were, your entire identity was." She stood, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. "Tell me, Mr. Prescott, when were you planning to reveal the truth? After you'd had your fill of playing cowboy? Or were you just going to disappear one day, leaving us all to wonder what happened to Sam Fletcher?" "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty in his voice was almost worse than a lie would have been. "I wanted to tell you, especially after what happened with the sheriff, but I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid you'd look at me exactly the way you're looking at me now." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Like I'm a stranger." The pain in his words tugged at her heart, but she forced herself to remain strong. "You are a stranger. The man I thought I was falling in love with doesn't exist." She moved toward the tent flap, but his voice stopped her. "He does exist," Sam said quietly. "He's sitting right here, more himself than he's ever been, because of you." "Is he?" She turned back to face him. "Or is he just another role you're playing, like the humble ranch hand who eats my cooking with such appreciation? Tell me, do you have servants to cook for you back home? A French chef, perhaps?" The direct hit found its mark. Sam's jaw tightened, and she saw the answer in his eyes before he spoke. "That's what I thought." She pushed through the tent flap and into the afternoon sunlight, her eyes burning with unshed tears. Behind her, she heard him call her name, but she didn't turn back. She couldn't bear to see the face she'd grown to love, wearing the expression of a man who'd been caught in an elaborate deception. As she walked back toward the fire, her mind raced with the implications of what she'd learned. If Sam was Samuel Prescott III, then her position here was even more precarious than she'd thought. She wasn't just a cook for a cattle drive, she was an employee of one of the most powerful families in the territory. And worse, she was a woman who'd allowed herself to care for a man who could never truly be hers, no matter what pretty words he might speak around a campfire under the stars. The days that followed their confrontation stretched like a chasm between them. Delilah maintained perfect professional courtesy, preparing meals with her usual skill but speaking to Sam only when necessary. She called him Mr. Fletcher with pointed formality, and he didn't correct her, though she caught the wince that crossed his face each time. The other men noticed the change, their easy camaraderie dampened by the tension that crackled between their cook and their leader. Jake Morrison shot worried glances between them, while Charlie shook his head sadly whenever he thought no one was looking. Delilah threw herself into her work with fierce determination, as if creating perfect meals could somehow restore the simple world she'd thought she inhabited. She discovered wild herbs growing near the creek lamb's quarters and purslane, prickly pear pads and wild mint. Her mother's recipe book, water-stained and precious, guided her as she experimented with frontier cooking that elevated their simple ingredients into something approaching art. The battered book had been her mother's most treasured possession, filled with careful notations about measurements and techniques, seasonal variations, and family preferences. Margaret Quinn had been a cook in grand houses before she'd married Delilah's father, and her knowledge of both fancy cuisine and practical frontier fare filled every page. Add sage to the cornbread when the nights turn cold, read one note in her mother's careful hand. Wild honey makes beef stew sing, but only a touch too much overwhelms the meat. Each recipe was more than instruction. It was a connection to the woman who'd taught her that cooking was an act of love, a way to nurture and care for others even when words failed. Now, as Delilah prepared supper for men who didn't know the truth about their employer, she found comfort in following her mother's guidance. The familiar rituals of chopping and seasoning, the careful attention to heat and timing these things remained constant, even when everything else in her world had shifted. "Miss Delilah," old Charlie said as she tended a pot of beans flavored with wild onions and sage, "I don't know what's got into you lately, but this cooking of yours keeps getting better. That stew last night was so good it made me weep." "Just following my mother's recipes," she said, stirring the beans with wooden spoon, worn smooth by generations of use. "Your mama must have been quite a cook." "She was." Delilah's voice softened, despite her efforts to maintain emotional distance. She said food was the language of the heart, that you could tell everything about a person by how they cooked and how they ate. Wise woman. What would she say about our Sam, you think? The question hit like a physical blow. Delilah's hand stilled on the spoon as she considered how her mother would have judged Sam, or rather, Samuel Prescott III. Margaret Quinn had worked in wealthy households. She'd seen the casual cruelty that often accompanied privilege, the way the rich could dispose of people like discarded dishware. But she'd also seen the rare exceptions employers who treated their staff with dignity, who recognized the humanity in those who served them. Which category did Sam fall into? She was no longer sure. "I think," Delilah said carefully, "she'd say that a man who eats with gratitude has a good heart, regardless of where he comes from." "And what about a man who protects those who can't protect themselves?" Before she could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. A small group of riders was coming up the valley, not the threatening presence of Sheriff Watkins and his men, but something that made Sam straighten with visible tension. 3 well-dressed men on fine horses, their clothes clean and their gear expensive. Even from a distance, Delilah could see the quality of their mounts and the authority in their bearing. These were not ordinary travelers. Sam moved to intercept them before they reached the main camp. But Delilah had positioned herself near the supply wagon, where she could hear their conversation. "Samuel," the lead rider called out, his voice carrying the crisp authority of education and wealth. "We've been looking for you." "Hello, Marcus," Sam replied, and Delilah heard resignation in his voice. "I wondered when you'd track me down." 3 months, Samuel. 3 months of your father sending search parties, and your fiancé wondering if you've taken leave of your senses." Fiancé. The word hit Delilah like a physical blow, even though she'd read about the engagement in Sam's journal. Hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that ink on paper could not. "I needed time to think," Sam said. "Time to play cowboy, you mean?" The man called Marcus dismounted, his expensive boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. Really, Samuel, this has gone far enough. Catherine is beginning to take your absence personally, and the business requires your attention. What business? Sam's voice held an edge that Delilah recognized the same tone he'd used with Sheriff Watkins. The railroad contracts, for one. The expansion into Colorado Territory, for another. Your father isn't getting any younger, and he needs his heir to start taking responsibility. Delilah found herself leaning closer, drawn despite herself to this glimpse into Sam's real world. She watched as one of the other reducer younger man, with soft features and expensive clothes, shook his head in apparent amazement. "Samuel, look at yourself," the young man said. "You're living like a common laborer, sleeping on the ground, eating beans from a tin plate. What would Mother say if she could see you now?" "Mother always said a man should know himself before he tries to lead others," Sam replied quietly. "She meant know your responsibilities, your duties to family and society, not this." The young man gestured dismissively at the camp. "This foolish, romantic notion about finding yourself through hardship." From her hiding place, Delilah watched Sam's face, saw the war between different versions of himself playing out in his expression. The humble ranch hand who'd shown her kindness was being challenged by the wealthy heir who had obligations and expectations. "I'm not ready to come back," Sam said finally. "When will you be ready?" Marcus demanded. "Catherine won't wait forever. There are other eligible men who would be delighted to marry into the Harrington fortune. Then perhaps she should marry one of them." The casual dismissal of his engagement sent a shock through Delilah. Was Sam actually considering breaking off his arranged marriage? And if so, what did that mean for her, for them? "Don't be ridiculous," the younger man said. "The union has been planned for years. Both families have invested significant resources in the arrangement." "Invested," Sam repeated bitterly, "like buying cattle or railroad stock. Marriage among people of our class has always been about more than romantic sentiment," Marcus said with obvious patience. "It's about alliance, about strengthening both families' positions. You know this, Samuel." "I know what I've been told. But what if I want something different?" "Such as?" Sam was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the camp. When his gaze found Delilah's hiding place, she thought for a moment that he could see her, that their eyes met across the distance. "Such as a life where I'm valued for who I am, not what I own," he said softly. Marcus followed his gaze, his eyes narrowing as he took in the camp and its inhabitants. "Samuel, surely you're not suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Sam said quickly. "I'm simply saying that I've learned things about myself out here, important things. Such as the fact that you can survive without servants. Congratulations. You've proven your point. Now it's time to return to reality." The conversation continued, but Delilah had heard enough. She slipped away from her hiding place and returned to the fire, her hands shaking as she stirred the beans that no longer held any appeal for her. Sam was engaged to be married. He had responsibilities, expectations, a whole life waiting for him in Denver. And despite whatever feelings might have developed between them around this campfire under the desert stars, that life was calling him back. She thought of her mother's recipe book, filled with wisdom about reading people through their relationship with food. What would Margaret Quinn say about a man who ate simple fare with such gratitude while knowing he could return to fine dining whenever he chose? Was it appreciation, or was it the novelty of temporary poverty? As the visiting riders prepared to leave, having failed to convince Sam to return with them immediately, Delilah found herself watching the young man who'd called Sam brother. The family resemblance was clear now that she knew to look for it. The same strong jaw and intelligent eyes, but softened by privilege and expectation. "1 month, Samuel," Marcus called out as they mounted their horses. "Your father expects you back in Denver within the month. Engagement announcement to follow immediately. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Sam said nothing, but Delilah saw the slump in his shoulders as the riders disappeared over the ridge. Whatever peace he'd found in this simple life, it was slipping away like water through his fingers. That evening, as she served supper to men who ate her food with genuine appreciation, Delilah found herself thinking about the difference between choice and necessity. These ranch hands praised her cooking because it represented sustenance, comfort, a touch of home on the lonely frontier. For them, her skills meant the difference between mere survival and actual nourishment. But for Samuel Prescott III, her cooking was an experience, a glimpse into a simpler world he could visit, but never truly inhabit. When he praised her biscuits, was he thinking of the French pastries that awaited him in Denver? When he thanked her for the simple stew, was he comparing it to the elaborate meals he'd grown up eating? The questions tormented her as she cleaned up after supper, watching Sam from the corner of her eye as he sat apart from the other men, lost in thought. Whatever battle was being fought in his mind, she was no longer sure she wanted to know the outcome. The discovery came 2 days later when Delilah was organizing the supply wagon and found the iron brand among Sam's possessions, a heavy piece of metal bearing the distinctive P surrounded by a circle that marked Prescott Ranch cattle. She stared at it for a long moment, the weight of its significance settling over her like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just any brand. She'd seen this mark on cattle throughout the territory, on supply wagons and equipment, even on the deed documents for land purchases. The Prescott brand was as recognizable as a signature, as powerful as a royal seal, and Sam carried it with him like a badge of office. That's quite a find. She spun around to see Sam standing behind her, his expression unreadable. In his hands he held a letter, the paper bearing official seals and expensive stationery. "I wasn't snooping," she said quickly, then caught herself. "Well, perhaps I was, but I was organizing supplies, and this was just—" "I know." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the sage and leather scent that had become so familiar. "I've been carrying it around like a millstone, wondering when I'd have the courage to show it to you." "Show me what? That you own half the territory? That every cow, every acre, every business decision around here ultimately belongs to you?" She gestured toward the grazing cattle. "Are these even your men, Sam, or are they your employees?" "They're my friends," he said quietly. "Whatever else is true, that's real." "Do they know?" "Some suspect. Charlie knows she's been with my family for 20 years. The others," he shrugged, "they follow my lead because they trust me, not because they know my name." Delilah set the brand down carefully, as if it might burn her fingers. "And what about me? What am I to you, an employee or a friend?" He stopped, running a hand through his dark hair. "Delilah, you're everything that matters." The simple words hit her harder than any elaborate declaration might have. She saw the truth in his eyes, the genuine pain and longing, but she also saw the impossibility of their situation. "I'm a homeless woman who cooks for cowboys," she said steadily. "You're Samuel Prescott III, heir to an empire. Those two things don't exist in the same world. They do out here, but not back there." She nodded toward the east, toward Denver and society, and everything that awaited him. "That letter, it's from your family, isn't it?" Sam nodded, his jaw tight. "Final notice. The engagement announcement will be published next week, with or without my presence. If I don't return by the end of the month, my father threatens to disinherit me. Maybe that would be for the best." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she saw him flinch as if she'd struck him. "You think I should walk away from everything? From the ranch, the business, the responsibility for hundreds of employees? I think you should stop pretending to be something you're not." The anger that had been building for days finally broke free. "You want to know what I think, Sam? I think you're a spoiled rich man who's playing at being poor, and when reality comes calling, you'll fold like a bad poker hand. That's not fair. Isn't it? You've been lying to everyone here about who you are. You've let me think we were equals. Let me imagine." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence that would reveal too much of her heart. "Let you imagine what?" "Nothing. It doesn't matter now." "It matters to me." He stepped closer, his voice urgent. "Delilah, whatever you were going to say, whatever you've been thinking—" "I was thinking like a fool," she said harshly. "I was imagining a future with a man who doesn't exist. Sam Fletcher might have loved me, but Samuel Prescott III, has obligations to someone else. The mention of his engagement hit its mark. Sam's face went pale, and she saw the war between duty and desire play out in his expression. "The engagement was arranged when I was 21, he said quietly. "I've never even kissed her." "But you will. You'll marry her and inherit your empire and have the life that was planned for you since birth." She picked up the brand again, its weight solid and real in her hands. "And someday, maybe you'll tell your children about the summer you spent playing cowboy and the woman who cooked for you under the stars. It won't be like that." "Won't it?" She challenged him with her eyes. "Look me in the face and tell me you're going to give up everything, your inheritance, your family, your social position, for a homeless woman with no prospects and a reputation for trouble." The silence stretched between them, filled with all the words he couldn't say. She watched the struggle in his face, saw the moment when reality conquered romance. "I thought so," she said softly. That evening, the tension in camp was thick enough to cut with a knife. The men felt it, their usual easy banter replaced by cautious quiet. Jake Morrison made several attempts to lighten the mood, but even his infectious humor couldn't penetrate the cloud that had settled over them. Delilah served supper mechanically, her movements precise, but lacking their usual warmth. When she set Sam's plate before him, their eyes met briefly, and she saw her own pain reflected in his gaze. "Miss Delilah," Charlie said after the meal, his weathered face creased with concern. "You've been mighty quiet lately. Everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Charlie, just tired." "Maybe you should rest more. This life's hard on folks who ain't used to it." The innocent comment struck like a lance. "I've been working hard my whole life, Charlie. I'm plenty used to it." "Didn't mean no offense," the old cowhand said quickly. "Just that some folks are cut out for this life, and others, well, others got different callings." She glanced at Sam, who was staring into the fire with the expression of a man wrestling with demons. "Yes," she said quietly. "I suppose they do." Later, as she cleaned up after the meal, she became aware of a commotion near the edge of camp. Voices raised in discussion, the sound of multiple horses approaching. Her heart sank as she recognized one of the voices, Marcus, Sam's family representative, had returned. But this time he wasn't alone. Through the gathering dusk, she could see a larger party, perhaps a dozen riders, including what appeared to be a woman riding side saddle on a magnificent bay mare. Sam had risen from the fire, his posture tense as he watched the approaching group. Even from a distance, Delilah could see that this wasn't another attempt at persuasion. This was a delegation with the power to end his frontier adventure once and for all. "Samuel," Marcus called out as they drew near, "I'd like you to meet someone who's traveled a very long way to see you." The woman on the bay mare urged her mount forward, and in the firelight, Delilah caught a glimpse of elegant features, expensive riding clothes, and an air of absolute confidence. This, she realized with a sinking heart, could only be Catherine Harrington, Sam's fiancée, come to claim her wayward intended. The game, whatever it had been, was over. Catherine Harrington was everything Delilah had expected, and worse. Beautiful in the way that money and breeding could create, she sat her side saddle with perfect posture, her riding habit impeccably tailored, and her dark hair swept into an elegant chignon beneath a feathered hat. Even after a long journey, she looked as if she'd stepped from the pages of a fashion magazine. "Samuel," she said as she dismounted with practiced grace, "you look positively barbaric." There was affection in her voice, but also a proprietary tone that made Delilah's stomach clench. This woman spoke to Sam as if she owned him, as if his current life was merely an amusing diversion from their inevitable future together. "Catherine," Sam's voice was carefully neutral. "This is unexpected." "I should hope so. When you disappeared without a word, I thought perhaps you'd been injured or worse. It never occurred to me that you were playing at being a common laborer." She looked around the camp with barely concealed distaste. "Really, Samuel, this has gone quite far enough." Delilah stood frozen near the supply wagon, forgotten in the drama unfolding before her. She watched as Catherine moved towards Sam with the confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything she wanted. "We need to talk," Catherine said, placing a gloved hand on Sam's arm. Privately. Anything you need to say can be said here, Sam replied, but Delilah heard the uncertainty in his voice. I think not. Catherine's eyes swept the camp until they found Delilah, and her gaze sharpened with the predatory instinct of a woman sizing up potential competition. Unless you've grown so attached to your audience that you prefer public displays. Marcus stepped forward, his expression grim. Samuel, we've brought something that requires your immediate attention. From a leather satchel, he produced a document bound with red ribbon and sealed with wax. The official nature of it was unmistakable, and Sam's face grew pale as he recognized what it represented. What is this? Sam asked, though his voice suggested he already knew. Your father's final ultimatum, Catherine said, her tone brisk and businesslike. The engagement announcement has already been sent to the newspapers. The wedding is scheduled for 6 weeks from today. If you're not in Denver by the end of this week, the disinheritance proceedings will begin. He can't. He can, and he will. Marcus opened the document, scanning its contents. Your grandfather's will contains specific provisions about heir behavior and family obligations. Your current lifestyle has been deemed detrimental to the family's interests. Delilah felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. She'd known this moment would come, had prepared herself for it, but seeing it unfold was different from imagining it. The man she'd fallen in love with was being claimed by forces beyond his control, and there was nothing she could do but watch. Samuel, Catherine said, her voice softening to almost tender tones. I know this seems sudden, but we've waited long enough. Our families have invested considerable resources in this union, and frankly, I'm tired of explaining your absence to society. What if I refuse? Sam asked quietly. Catherine's laugh was like silver bells, beautiful and cold. Refuse what? Our engagement? Don't be ridiculous. We've been promised to each other since we were children. It's not a matter of choice. It's a matter of duty. And if I choose duty to something else? Such as? Catherine followed his gaze to where Delilah stood, and her expression sharpened with understanding. Oh, Samuel, please tell me you haven't allowed yourself to become attached to one of your employees. The way she said employees made it sound like something distasteful, and Delilah felt heat flood her cheeks. But worse than the casual disdain was the assumption that her feelings that she herself was merely an obstacle to be brushed aside. Miss Quinn is, Sam began, but Catherine cut him off with a raised hand. I'm sure she's perfectly adequate at whatever it is she does. But really, Samuel, we must be practical. Even if you were free to pursue such an infatuation, what could you possibly offer each other? From her satchel, Catherine withdrew another document, unfolding it with deliberate ceremony. This is our marriage contract, already signed by both our fathers. The financial arrangements, the property settlements, the merger of our two families' interests, it's all here. She held the paper towards Sam, and even from her distance, Delilah could see the elaborate legal language, the official seals, the signatures that bound two lives together with the weight of law and expectation. You see, Catherine continued, this isn't simply a matter of personal preference. The Harrington Railroad interests and the Prescott cattle empire have been planning this union for years. Our marriage will create the largest transportation and livestock operation in the Western Territories. A business merger, Sam said bitterly. A sensible arrangement between families of similar standing. Catherine's voice held a note of impatience. Really, Samuel, you can't have expected to marry for love like some shopkeeper's daughter. We have responsibilities to our families, our legacies. Delilah wanted to run, to escape, before she heard any more of this conversation that laid out the impossibility of her situation with brutal clarity. But something kept her rooted in place, perhaps the need to see how Sam would respond to this moment of ultimate choice. What if I told you I've already given my heart to someone else? Sam asked quietly. Catherine's expression didn't change, but Delilah caught the slight tightening around her eyes. I would say that hearts are changeable things, while legal contracts are not. Besides, she added with calculating sweetness, I'm sure your friend would understand that you have obligations beyond personal sentiment. She turned to look directly at Delilah, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the camp with perfect clarity. Wouldn't you, my dear? Surely a woman of your circumstances understands that Samuel has duties that transcend temporary attraction. A man of his position simply cannot throw away his entire future for a romantic whim. The words hit like physical blows. Delilah felt every eye in the camp upon her, saw the mixture of pity and discomfort in the faces of the men who'd become like family to her. But worst of all was the expression on Sam's face, the desperate hope that she would somehow make this easier for him, that she would release him from the impossible choice he was being forced to make. "I understand perfectly," Delilah said, her voice steady despite the breaking of her heart. "Mr. Prescott has responsibilities that I could never ask him to abandon." She saw Sam flinch at her use of his formal name, but she couldn't bring herself to call him by the name that had been a lie from the beginning. "Excellent," Catherine said with satisfaction. "I knew you'd be reasonable. Samuel, shall we discuss the wedding arrangements? I've taken the liberty of engaging the cathedral in Denver, and Mother has already begun planning the reception." But Sam was staring at Delilah, his face a mask of pain and regret. "Delilah—" "Miss Quinn will be fine," Catherine interrupted smoothly. "I'm sure she'll find other employment, perhaps something more suitable to her station." The casual dismissal was the final insult. Delilah straightened her shoulders, calling upon every scrap of dignity her mother had taught her to maintain. "If you'll excuse me," she said quietly, "I need to begin preparing for my departure." "Delilah, wait." Sam started toward her, but Catherine's hand on his arm stopped him. "Let her go, Samuel. It's better this way. Clean breaks are always less painful in the long run." As Delilah walked toward her tent, she heard Catherine's voice continuing, discussing travel arrangements and wedding preparations, as if the last few months of Sam's life had been nothing more than an unfortunate detour from his predetermined path. Inside her tent, she sat on her bedroll and stared at the few possessions she'd accumulated during her time with the cattle drive. Her mother's cast-iron skillet, the water-stained recipe book, the simple dress Sam had complimented just a week ago when she'd thought her future held infinite possibilities. Now she understood the truth that her mother had tried to teach her years ago. Love between different classes was a luxury that only the wealthy could afford, and even then, only when it didn't interfere with more important considerations. Samuel Prescott III would marry Catherine Harrington, inherit his empire, and eventually forget the summer he'd spent playing cowboy with a homeless woman who'd been foolish enough to believe in fairy tales. And she would move on, as she always had, carrying nothing but her skills and her stubborn pride, and the bitter knowledge that sometimes love wasn't enough to bridge the gap between one world and another. Delilah spent the night writing not recipes or practical notes, but a letter that cost her more than any words she'd ever put to paper. By the flickering light of a small candle, she poured her heart onto the page, knowing it would likely be the last time she'd allow herself such vulnerability. "Sam, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I want you to know that I don't blame you for the choice you have to make. We both knew this couldn't last forever, though I confess I let myself hope for longer than wisdom should have allowed. You asked me once what my mother would say about a man who ate with gratitude. The truth is, she would have seen right through your disguise from the beginning. Margaret Quinn had a gift for reading people, and she would have known that Sam Fletcher was too good to be true. She would have told me to guard my heart better. But she also would have recognized something else, that underneath all the lies and pretense, you're a good man trying to do the right thing. I've watched you with your men, seen how you care for them, how you take responsibility for their welfare. That wasn't pretense. Whatever name you use, that part of you is real. I won't ask you to choose differently. Catherine Harrington is beautiful and educated, and everything a man of your position should want in a wife. More importantly, she represents the life you were born to lead, the responsibilities you can't abandon without destroying everything your family has built. But I need you to know that what happened between us wasn't just a passing fancy for me. I loved Sam Fletcher with everything in me, and I believe I have to believe that some part of him was real. Hold on to that part, Sam. Don't let the weight of duty crush everything that made you human. Take care of Charlie and the boys. They love you, whatever name they call you by. And someday, when you're living in your mansion with your proper wife, remember that there was a time when you slept under the stars and ate beans from a tin plate and were happier than you'd ever been. I'll remember it too. Delilah. She folded the letter carefully and placed it on his pillow, then gathered her few belongings. The pre-dawn darkness would give her the head start she needed to avoid painful goodbyes, or worse, attempts to stop her that would only make leaving harder than it already was. But as she stepped out of her tent, she found Sam sitting by the dying fire, still dressed in the clothes he'd worn during the confrontation with Catherine. He looked up as she approached, and she saw that he hadn't slept either. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "It's better this way." She set down her bundle and moved to the fire, stirring the coals automatically. Even now, in the midst of heartbreak, the habits of caring for others remained strong. "Is it?" She didn't answer immediately, focusing instead on building up the fire for the breakfast she wouldn't be there to cook. "Your fiancé is right about one thing. Clean breaks are less painful in the long run." What if I don't want a clean break? What if I want to fight for this, for us? The words she'd been hoping and dreading to hear hung between them like a bridge she didn't dare cross. "With what?" she asked quietly. "You'd give up your inheritance, your family, your entire world. For what? A homeless woman with no prospects and a reputation for trouble." "For the woman I love," he said simply. The declaration hit her like a physical blow. She'd known he cared for her, had seen it in his eyes, and felt it in the gentle way he spoke to her. But hearing the word love spoken aloud in the pre-dawn silence made everything infinitely more complicated. "Sam, and I think you love me too," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "I think that's why you're running, because staying would mean making the same impossible choice I'm facing." She turned to face him then, seeing in the firelight the man who'd become everything to her, not Samuel Prescott III, with his wealth and obligations, but Sam Fletcher, who'd offered her work and protection, and the first real home she'd known since her mother's death. "Of course I love you," she whispered. "But love doesn't change the facts. You have responsibilities." "What if I walked away from them?" "Could you? Really?" She studied his face, looking for the truth beneath the desperate hope. "Could you turn your back on your family's empire, knowing that hundreds of people depend on it for their livelihoods? Could you let everything your grandfather built crumble because you fell in love with someone society deems unsuitable?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know I can't marry Catherine, not feeling the way I do about you." "Then don't marry her. Find some other way to fulfill your obligations, some compromise that doesn't require you to sacrifice your happiness." She moved closer to him, close enough to see the pain in his eyes. "But don't throw away everything for me, Sam. I couldn't live with that burden. What if throwing it away is the only way to keep my soul?" Before she could answer, the sound of movement from the tents around them signaled that the camp was beginning to wake. Soon the other men would emerge, and the painful privacy of this conversation would be lost. "I have to go," she said, picking up her bundle. "Where? Where will you go?" "North, maybe, or south toward New Mexico. There are always places that need cooks." She managed a smile that felt like it might break her face. "Don't worry about me, Sam. I survived before I met you, and I'll survive after. That's not living, that's just existing. Sometimes existing is enough." She started to turn away, but his voice stopped her. "Delilah, the letter you left, I read it." Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She'd hoped to be gone before he found it, to avoid this exact conversation. "I meant every word," she said simply. "So did I. When I said I loved you." He stood, moving toward her with the careful movements of a man trying not to spook a wild animal. "That wasn't a lie, whatever else might have been. That was the truest thing I've ever said." "I know." The words came out as barely a whisper. "That's what makes this so hard." Around them, the camp was coming fully awake. She could hear Charlie's morning cough, the sound of men stirring in their bedrolls, the restless movement of cattle greeting the dawn. Soon this place that had been her sanctuary would be fully alive with activity, and she would no longer belong to it. "There's something else," Sam said, his voice urgent with the knowledge that their time was running out. "Something you should know before you make your final decision." "Sam, please. Catherine and Eve never been lovers. We've barely even been friends. The engagement was arranged by our families when we were children, but I've never felt anything for her beyond polite friendship." "That doesn't change anything." "Doesn't it? You said yourself that she's everything a man of my position should want. But what if what I want is something completely different? What if what I want is a woman who can make magic with simple ingredients, who faces down sheriffs with nothing but courage, who sees through all my pretenses to the man I really am?" Delilah closed her eyes, fighting against the hope his words kindled in her chest. "And what about the ranch? The business empire? The hundreds of people who depend on the Prescott name? What if there was another way? What if I could find a path that honored my obligations without sacrificing my heart?" "What are you talking about?" "I don't know yet, but I do know this. I can't let you walk away without a fight. I can't spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to choose love over duty." "Sam, give me time," he said urgently. "Give me a chance to find another solution before you disappear forever." "How much time?" "I don't know. A day, a week, however long it takes to prove that love can be stronger than obligation, that two people from different worlds can build something together." The hope in his voice was painful to hear because she wanted so desperately to believe him. But she'd learned long ago that hoping for impossible things only led to greater heartbreak. "And if you can't find another way, then I'll let you go. I won't pursue you or try to change your mind. But please, Delilah, give me the chance to try." She looked at him standing in the morning light, no longer the humble cowboy she'd fallen in love with, but not yet the wealthy heir he was supposed to become. He was caught between two worlds, just as she was, and perhaps that shared understanding was worth one more leap of faith. "1 week," she said finally. "I'll give you 1 week to find your miraculous solution. But if you can't, I know, and I'll accept whatever choice you make." As the sun crested the eastern ridge and painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, Delilah made a decision that went against every survival instinct she'd developed over years of hardship and disappointment. She would stay, she would hope, and she would pray that sometimes, just sometimes, love really could conquer all. The confrontation came 3 days later, when Sam's father himself arrived at the camp with a full entourage that included lawyers, family advisors, and enough armed men to make his intentions unmistakably clear. Thomas Prescott II was everything his son was note-imposing, coldly authoritative, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. "Samuel," he said without preamble as he dismounted from a magnificent black stallion, "this foolishness ends now." Delilah watched from her position near the cook fire as father faced son across 20 yards of desert ground. The older Prescott wore expensive clothes that somehow managed to look practical rather than pretentious, and his bearing spoke of a man accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. "Father," Sam's voice was carefully controlled, "I wasn't expecting you. Clearly. If you had been, you might have spared us all this embarrassment by returning home when first requested." Thomas Prescott's eyes swept the camp with obvious distaste before settling on his son. "Look at yourself, Samuel. You're living like a vagrant, consorting with common laborers, shirking every responsibility that comes with your name and position." "I'm learning about the business from the ground up," Sam replied. "I thought you'd approve of that." "Don't be clever with me, boy. You're hiding from your obligations, plain and simple." The older man gestured toward his entourage. "I've brought the necessary documents to legally compel your return. You are hereby ordered to accompany me to Denver, where you will fulfill your engagement to Miss Harrington and assume your proper role in the family enterprise." Sam's jaw tightened. "And if I refuse? Then you will be formally disinherited, effective immediately. Every asset, every share of stock, every acre of land that was to be yours will pass to your cousin Robert." You will have nothing, no name, no fortune, no future." The words fell like hammer blows, and Delilah saw their impact in the way Sam's shoulders straightened, as if bracing against a physical assault. Around the camp, the ranch hands had gathered at a respectful distance, their faces grim as they witnessed their leader being stripped of his dignity by degrees. "Furthermore," Thomas Prescott continued, "any person found to be harboring or assisting you in defying this order will be considered an enemy of the Prescott family, with all that implies for their future prospects in this territory." The threat was clear and brutal. Anyone who helped Sam would find themselves blacklisted from employment, unable to buy supplies, effectively exiled from civilized society. It was the kind of power that only immense wealth could wield, and the older Prescott wielded it like a sword. "You can't do this," Sam said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I can, and I will. The family lawyers have reviewed every document, every contract, every provision of your grandfather's will. Your inheritance is contingent upon your fulfilling certain obligations to the family name and honor by pursuing this infatuation. With a woman of questionable reputation, you have violated those terms. Delilah has done nothing wrong." "Miss Quinn," Thomas Prescott said, turning his cold gaze toward her, "is a woman who fled one territory under suspicion of theft and assault, who has no family, no prospects, and no standing in decent society. The very fact that you would consider such a person as anything more than temporary hired help demonstrates how far you've fallen from the standards expected of a Prescott." The casual cruelty of the assessment hit Delilah like a physical blow, but what hurt more was seeing Sam's face as his father systematically demolished any argument for their relationship. "However," the older man continued, "I am not without mercy. Miss Quinn, if you remove yourself from my son's vicinity immediately and permanently, I am prepared to offer you a substantial sum enough to establish yourself in a new territory where your history need not follow you." He produced a bank draft from his vest pocket, the amount clearly visible even from Delilah's distance. It was more money than she'd ever seen in one place, enough to buy a small business or property of her own, enough to ensure she'd never again face the kind of desperate poverty that had driven her to this camp in the first place. "All you need do," Thomas Prescott said, "is sign this document stating that you will have no further contact with my son, and the money is yours. Surely even a woman of your limited circumstances can see the wisdom in such an arrangement." The silence that followed was deafening. Delilah felt every eye in the camp upon her, saw the mixture of hope and dread in Sam's face, the calculating satisfaction in his father's expression. The bank draft fluttered slightly in the morning breeze, its promise of security and independence tantalizingly real. "And if I refuse?" she asked quietly. "Then you will leave anyway, but with nothing. I have the resources to ensure that no respectable establishment in 3 territories will employ you. You will find yourself in circumstances far worse than those from which my son rescued you." The word rescued was spoken with particular venom, designed to reduce her relationship with Sam to nothing more than charity. But Delilah had faced down bullies before, and she recognized the tactic for what it was, an attempt to make her feel small, powerless, grateful for whatever scraps of kindness she was offered. "I see," she said, stepping forward with the same dignity her mother had taught her to maintain in the face of any insult. "And what does Sam think of this generous offer?" Thomas Prescott's eyes hardened. "My son's opinion is irrelevant. He has proven himself incapable of making rational decisions regarding his future. That is why I am here to ensure that those decisions are made for him." "Father," Sam began, but the older man cut him off with a gesture. "You have had your chance to end this appropriately, Samuel. Your continued defiance forces me to more direct methods." He turned back to Delilah, the bank draft still extended in his gloved hand. "What will it be, Miss Quinn? Financial independence and a fresh start, or stubborn pride and inevitable destitution?" Delilah looked at the money, then at Sam, whose face had gone pale with the understanding of what his father was asking her to do. She thought of her mother's words about the truth always coming due, about the debts that lies created. "Mr. Prescott," she said clearly, "you can keep your money." The older man's eyebrows rose in surprise. "I beg your pardon? I said you can keep your money. I won't be bought, and I won't be threatened into abandoning someone I care about." She turned to face Sam fully, drawing strength from the love she saw in his eyes. "Your son is a good man, better than you seem to realize. If you can't see that, then perhaps the problem isn't with his judgment, but with yours." The gasps from the assembled group were audible. No one spoke to Thomas Prescott with such directness, especially not a woman with no social standing or protection. But Delilah had reached the point where she had nothing left to lose except her self-respect, and that she would not surrender. "You insolent," Thomas Prescott began, his face flushing with rage. "Enough." Sam's voice cut through the tension like a blade, carrying an authority that made everyone turn to look at him. "Father, you've made your position clear. Now I'll make mine." He stepped forward, positioning himself between Delilah and his father, and when he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable tone of a man who had finally chosen his path. "I renounce my inheritance," he said clearly. "I give up all claim to the Prescott name, fortune, and properties. I choose to make my own way in the world, with the woman I love at my side." The declaration hit like thunder, and for a moment, no one moved or spoke. Then Thomas Prescott's face went white with fury, and Delilah realized that Sam had just sacrificed everything, his entire future, his security, his family for her. The keys to the main house, which his father had brought as a symbol of the inheritance Sam was rejecting, fell from the older man's nerveless fingers and landed in the dust at their feet. "Samuel," Thomas Prescott said, his voice deadly quiet, "if you walk away from this family, there will be no coming back, no forgiveness, no reconciliation. You will be dead to me." "Then so be it," Sam replied, his hand finding Delilah's and holding it firmly. "I've spent my entire life trying to live up to your expectations, trying to be the son you wanted instead of the man I am. I'm done with that. You're making the biggest mistake of your life." "No, Father. The biggest mistake would be marrying a woman I don't love to inherit wealth I don't want, while the woman I do love walks away forever." Thomas Prescott's face cycled through emotions, rage, disbelief, and finally a cold calculation that was somehow more frightening than his anger. "Very well," he said, bending to retrieve the fallen keys. "But understand this, Samuel, this gesture of yours changes nothing for Miss Quinn. She will still be exactly what she was before, a woman with no family, no prospects, and now no protection. You think love will sustain you when you're both living in poverty, when you're working as a common laborer and she's taking in washing to help make ends meet." "We'll manage," Sam said firmly. "Will you? You've never known real hardship, boy. You've been playing at poverty for a few months, but you've always known you could return to comfort when the game grew tiresome. Now you're proposing to make it permanent for both of you." Delilah felt the weight of the older man's words, saw the truth in them. Sam had been living a carefully controlled adventure, with the safety net of his inheritance always there beneath him. Now he was proposing to cut that net away entirely, and she wasn't sure he truly understood what that meant. "Maybe your father's right," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the wind. "What?" Sam turned to her, his face stricken. "Maybe this is a mistake. Maybe you should." "No." His grip on her hand tightened. "Don't let him do this, Delilah. Don't let him make you doubt what we have." "I'm not doubting what we have. I'm doubting whether it's worth destroying your entire future." "You are my future." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, and Thomas Prescott laughed a sound without warmth or humor. How romantic. How utterly impractical. He gestured toward his lawyers, who had been waiting silently throughout the confrontation. "Gentlemen, please prepare the disinheritance documents. My son has made his choice." But as the lawyers moved forward with their papers, Sam suddenly straightened, his expression changing, as if he'd just remembered something crucial. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying a new note of authority. Before you do anything irreversible, there's something you should know." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather portfolio, bound with official ribbons and seals. Thomas Prescott's eyes narrowed as he recognized the documents. "What is that?" "The original partnership agreement between grandfather and the Harrington family. The one that established the terms of my engagement to Catherine." Sam opened the portfolio, scanning the legal language with practiced ease. "I've been studying it quite carefully over the past few days." "That agreement is ironclad, Samuel. Both families' lawyers ensured." "Both families' lawyers assumed I would never actually read the fine print," Sam interrupted. "But I have. And there's something very interesting in Section 12, subsection 4. He pulled out a specific page, pointing to a paragraph dense with legal terminology. "It states that the marriage arrangement is contingent upon the mutual consent of both parties, and that either party may withdraw from the engagement if they can demonstrate that fulfilling it would require them to act against their fundamental moral principles." Thomas Prescott's face went pale. That clause was inserted at Catherine's insistence as protection against being forced into marriage with someone morally unsuitable. "Exactly, but it works both ways." Sam looked up from the document, his expression grimmer than Delilah had ever seen it. "I hereby formally notify the Harrington family that I cannot, in good conscience, marry Catherine while I am in love with another woman. To do so would violate my fundamental moral principles regarding the sanctity of marriage." "You can't." "I can and I am. Furthermore," Sam continued, withdrawing another document, "this is a proposal I've been working on for the past 3 days. A new business arrangement that would maintain the partnership between our families while dissolving the personal obligations." He handed the papers to his father, whose hands shook slightly as he read. "I'm proposing to transfer my inheritance to a trust, managed jointly by both families, with myself as the operational director. The ranch continues to operate. The employees keep their jobs. The business partnerships remain intact, but I retain the right to manage my personal life as I see fit. This is," Thomas Prescott began, then stopped as he read further. "This is actually legally sound. I had help from some very good lawyers in Cheyenne," Sam admitted. "Men who understood that there might be a middle path between total capitulation and complete rebellion." Delilah stared at him in amazement. While she'd been preparing to sacrifice their love for his obligations, he'd been working to find a way to honor both. The partnership agreement he was proposing would give him the freedom to choose his own life while ensuring that his family's empire remained strong. "But Catherine," Thomas Prescott protested weakly, "will be relieved, I think. She's a practical woman who deserves a husband who can love her properly, not one who's honoring a contract." Sam's voice gentled slightly. "This way, she's free to find real happiness, and so am I." Thomas Prescott looked down at the documents again, then at his son, and finally at Delilah. For the first time since his arrival, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "You've thought of everything," he said slowly. "Not everything, but enough." Sam turned to Delilah, pulling another document from the portfolio. "Which brings me to this." The paper he held out to her was covered in his careful handwriting, dense with legal language, but topped with a simple title that made her heart stop. "Partnership Agreement Prescott Ranch, Operation Samuel Prescott III and Delilah Quinn co-directors." 6 months later, the branding iron that bore both their initials, D.S., enclosed in a circle, was pressed into the hide of their first jointly owned calf. The new brand represented everything they'd built together, a partnership based on equality, respect, and the kind of love that grows stronger when tested by adversity. Delilah stood at the fence of the main corral, watching Sam work alongside the ranch hands who'd become their extended family. The transition hadn't been easy. Society had struggled to accept a former homeless woman as co-owner of one of the territory's largest ranches, but their success had gradually silenced most critics. The secret, she'd learned, was refusing to apologize for who they were or how they'd found each other. When Denver society ladies came calling with barely concealed curiosity about the unusual arrangement, Delilah served them her grandmother's pound cake and spoke matter-of-factly about cattle breeding and market prices until they either accepted her competence or left in frustration. "Miss Delilah," Jake Morrison called out as he approached the fence, his freckled face beaming with the satisfaction of good work done. "Sam wants to know if you're ready for the tour." She smiled, adjusting the simple but well-made dress that had replaced her worn calico. "I suppose it's time." The tour had become a monthly tradition, a chance for them to ride the boundaries of their land together, checking on the cattle and discussing the endless decisions that came with running such a large operation. But more than that, it was time for them to remember how far they'd come from that desperate evening when she'd stumbled into his camp with nothing but a skillet and wounded pride. Sam rode up on his favorite horse, a steady bay gelding that reminded her of the man himself, reliable, strong, and surprisingly gentle when the situation called for it. He'd changed in the months since their confrontation with his father, becoming more confident in his authority, but never losing the humility that had first drawn her to him. "Ready?" he asked, extending his hand to help her mount her own horse, a spirited mare she'd named Sage for the color of her coat. "Ready," she confirmed, settling into the side saddle with the ease that had come from months of practice. They rode out together across the vast expanse of grassland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The Prescott Spread, officially the Prescott Quinn Ranch, according to the legal documents, covered more than 200,000 acres of some of the finest grazing land in Wyoming Territory. "Charlie's boys finished the new fence along the southern boundary," Sam reported as they rode. "And we got word from the railroad that they're accepting our bid for the autumn cattle shipment. At the price we quoted, every penny, seems our reputation for quality beef is spreading." Delilah felt the familiar surge of pride that came with such news. They'd worked hard to build that reputation, improving the bloodlines of their cattle and implementing new techniques they'd learned from other successful ranchers. The business was thriving under their joint management, proving that their unconventional partnership was more than just a romantic gesture. "What about the new ranch hands?" she asked. "The 3 boys from Kansas." "Good workers, all of them. Jake's taken them under his wing, teaching them our ways." Sam's voice held the satisfaction of a man who'd found his true calling. "They seem to understand that we do things differently here." Different was an understatement. The Prescott Quinn Ranch was known throughout the territory for treating its employees fairly, paying good wages, and maintaining working conditions that other operations couldn't match. It had started as Sam's way of honoring the men who'd been loyal to him during his months of deception, but it had evolved into something larger, a demonstration that business success and human decency weren't mutually exclusive. As they crested a hill that offered a panoramic view of their domain, Sam pulled up his horse and dismounted, offering his hand to help Delilah down. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their cattle graze peacefully in the distance, while the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose. "Do you ever regret it?" Sam asked suddenly. "Giving up the chance for a simpler life?" Delilah considered the question seriously. Her days now were filled with business meetings and correspondence, decisions about breeding programs and market strategies. It was a far cry from the simple routine of cooking for a dozen ranch hands around a campfire. "No," she said finally, "this is harder, but it's mine, ours. I spent so many years just surviving that I'd forgotten what it felt like to actually build something." "And Catherine? Do you ever wonder what might have happened if I'd made the expected choice?" That was a question she'd wrestled with during the dark moments when self-doubt crept in. Catherine Harrington had indeed been relieved to escape their engagement and had married a railroad magnate from California within 3 months. By all accounts, she was blissfully happy with a man who shared her social aspirations and love of formal society. "I think we all ended up where we were meant to be," Delilah said. "Catherine has her railroad baron. Your father has his business empire intact, and we have each other." Sam finished, his arm sliding around her waist. "And our partnership," she agreed, leaning into his warmth. They'd been married in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Charlie giving her away and Jake Morrison standing as Sam's best man. The guest list had been small, mostly ranch hands and local friends, but Thomas Prescott had surprised everyone by attending his presence, a grudging acknowledgement that his son's unconventional choice had proven successful. The relationship with Sam's father remained formal but respectful. He'd never quite forgiven them for disrupting his carefully laid plans, but he couldn't argue with the ranch's profitability or his son's evident happiness. Progress, Delilah supposed, came in small steps. "Speaking of partnerships," Sam said, his voice taking on a note she'd learned to recognize, "I have something for you." From his saddlebag, he withdrew a small wrapped package tied with ribbon. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a miniature version of their joint brand, crafted in silver and designed to be worn as a pendant. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the intricate metalwork. "Read the inscription," he said softly. On the back, in tiny engraved letters, were the words, "From the cook fire out D.S. Partners in all things." As he fastened the chain around her neck, Delilah thought about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. From a desperate woman with a cast-iron skillet to the co-owner of a cattle empirite was the kind of transformation that seemed impossible until it happened. "So," Sam said, as they prepared to ride back to the ranch house where a warm supper and their own hearth awaited, "what does my partner think about expanding into horse breeding?" Delilah laughed, the sound carrying across the vast expanse of their shared domain. "I think your partner would like to hear your proposal over dinner." As they rode toward home through the gathering dusk, the new brand on their cattle gleamed in the fading light, a symbol of two people who dared to believe that love and determination could overcome any obstacle, and who'd built something lasting from the ashes of their individual struggles. The humble cook fire, where their partnership had begun, might be gone, but its spirit lived on in every decision they made together, every challenge they faced as equals, every sunset they shared on the land they'd claimed not through birthright or charity, but through the simple, revolutionary act of choosing each other.